The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through that single corridor moves 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Every barrel that heats a home in Germany, fuels a factory in Japan, or fills a tank in Texas. One nation controls whether that corridor stays open. That nation is currently under American bombardment, and it is still deciding who gets their oil. Here is what the financial headlines are not telling you. In the last 30 days, oil markets moved $14 billion in value without a single Iranian missile hitting a tanker. Not one. Because physical destruction was never the actual weapon. Tehran discovered something far more dangerous than firepower. The credible threat of closing Hormuz costs Iran nothing to maintain. Responding to that threat has already cost the global economy more than the entire Iranian defense budget for the last decade. A country with no aircraft carrier, no global banking access, and 40 years of sanctions behind it is dictating terms to the most sophisticated financial system ever constructed. And nobody in Washington has a clean answer for how that happened. Before we go deeper, where are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments right now, because what unfolds next in that strait hits your fuel prices, your grocery bills, and your economy differently, depending on where you live. To understand why Iran holds this power, you need to go back exactly 40 years. In 1984, while Saddam Hussein was firing Scud missiles into Iranian cities, Tehran made a decision that would reshape the entire Middle East. They would never again depend on anyone else for their survival. That single decision built everything you are watching unfold today. Not the missiles, not the drones, the economic architecture underneath them. Iran did not just build weapons. It built an entire parallel system designed to function while the world tried to strangle it financially. Consider the paradox at the center of this entire conflict. The sanctions designed to prevent Iran from building this arsenal were the exact conditions that made the arsenal impossible to dismantle. Cut a country off from every external supplier for 4 decades, and it stops needing external suppliers. That is not an accident of history. That is the most expensive strategic miscalculation of the last 40 years. And here's where it gets precise. Every drone Iran deploys costs between $20 and $200 to produce. Every intercept fired to stop it costs America and its allies between $1 million and $15 million. Iran has been running that equation deliberately, patiently, and at industrial scale, but the missile and drone campaign was never the main event. It was the setup for something far more damaging, a direct attack on the one resource the entire global economy cannot replace overnight: oil. The Hormuz Strait handles 20 million barrels of crude every single day. Liquefied natural gas shipments worth $500 billion annually move through that same narrow passage. A sustained disruption does not just raise fuel prices, it triggers a cascade that hits food costs, manufacturing, shipping, and inflation simultaneously across every continent. Iran has not blocked Hormuz yet. That is the most important sentence in this entire video, because the threat of blocking it, credible, sustained, and deliberately maintained, is already doing exactly what a blockade would do to commodity markets. Which raises the question nobody in the financial press is asking clearly enough. If Iran can move global oil markets by $14 billion without firing a single shot at a tanker, what happens the moment it decides to fire one? That answer is coming. And the number attached to it will shock you. Here is the number nobody wants to say out loud. If Iran closes Hormuz for just 30 days, independent energy economists project a global oil price spike to $180 per barrel. That is not a war scenario. That is a shipping disruption scenario. For context, the 2008 financial crisis was triggered when oil briefly touched $147. A sustained Hormuz closure would not just break that record, it would shatter the entire pricing model Western economies are built around. And Iran knows exactly what that number does to the political stability of every government dependent on cheap energy. But understanding how Iran built this leverage requires understanding one specific moment. In December 2011, an American surveillance drone, the Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel, went off course and landed intact inside Iranian territory. Tehran did not destroy it, Tehran studied it. Iranian engineers did not just study the downed drone. They dismantled every system, mapped every circuit, and rebuilt the entire platform from scratch. The process produced 3 new weapons. But the third one changed the entire economic equation of modern warfare. A $200 drone, built from stolen American technology, now forcing a superpower to spend $15 million per attempt to stop it. The economic recursion of that moment is almost difficult to believe. America lost a drone to Iran. Iran copied it, improved it, and mass-produced it at $200 per unit. The United States then spent between $1 million and $15 million per interceptor trying to stop the thing Iran built from American technology. Every single launch cycle transferred wealth from Washington to Tehran without Iran spending anything meaningful at all. That wealth transfer has a precise name in military economics. It is called asymmetric attrition, and Iran has been executing it with extraordinary discipline for 3 consecutive years. Not because Iran is more powerful than America, because Iran designed its entire strategy around making American power as expensive as possible to deploy. And here is the detail that makes this economically irreversible. Iran's entire production chain, the drones, the missiles, the underground launch infrastructure, costs approximately $4 billion annually to maintain and expand. The United States spent more than that in the first 11 days of this operation alone responding to it. Iran is not just winning the cost ratio on individual weapons. It is winning the annual budget war by a factor that makes prolonged engagement mathematically unsustainable. And that weapons economy feeds directly into the oil leverage equation. Every drone that costs $200 to launch forces a defensive response, costing 20 to 28 times more to neutralize. Multiply that ratio across hundreds of simultaneous launches, and the interceptor stockpiles of America's Gulf allies begin depleting faster than resupply chains can replenish them. Qatar privately communicated to Washington that at Iran's launch tempo, Patriot interceptor stocks would be exhausted within 4 days. 4 days. The most expensive defensive architecture ever assembled in the Middle East. 4 days from being operationally blind, and Iran had not yet touched a single oil tanker, which brings us to the part of this story that the mainstream energy coverage is consistently failing to explain. Iran is not fighting a military campaign with economic side effects. Iran is fighting an economic campaign with military tools. The distinction sounds small. The consequences are not small at all. Every war has a moment where the original assumptions collapse. For this conflict, that moment arrived quietly, not on a battlefield, but inside a commodity trading terminal in Singapore at 3:47 in the morning. Oil futures jumped 11% in under 6 minutes. No missile had been fired. No tanker had been touched. A single Iranian military spokesman had simply stated that Hormuz options remain on the table. 11%, 6 minutes. Zero kinetic action. That is the architecture of Iran's economic war reduced to its purest form. Language as a weapon, ambiguity as a delivery system, markets as the actual battlefield. And the target is not Israel, not American military bases, not Gulf infrastructure. The target is the cost of maintaining the entire Western-led response. To understand why that strategy is working, you need to understand what sits on the other side of the Hormuz equation. Japan imports 90% of its oil through that strait. Not 40%, not 60%, 90%. South Korea and India are not far behind. And every single one of those governments has privately told Washington the same thing. A prolonged closure is not a foreign policy problem for them. It is a government survival problem. America's coalition is fracturing, but not from battlefield losses. It is fracturing from fuel price projections landing on the desks of finance ministers who answer to voters, not to the Pentagon. Military losses can be absorbed, explained, reframed. A 40% household energy spike arrives at the ballot box with no reframing possible. Iran identified this fracture point decades before this conflict began. The strategic logic was documented inside Iranian military planning documents as early as 2005. Hormuz was never just a geographic choke point. It was always the economic trigger, the one lever capable of turning regional allies against Washington without firing a single shot at them directly. And now that lever is being pulled in full public view. The strait remains technically open. Tankers are still moving, but insurance premiums for vessels transiting Hormuz have increased 340% since February 28th. Shipping companies are rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 days and approximately $800,000 per voyage to delivery costs. That rerouting cost does not stay inside the shipping industry. It transfers directly into the price of every product that moves by sea: electronics, pharmaceuticals, clothing, food. Iran has effectively imposed a global transit tax without controlling a single port outside its own territory. No sanctions required. No international permission needed. But the most consequential development is not the insurance premiums or the rerouting costs. It is what Iran has deliberately chosen not to do yet. The Khorramshahr-4 ballistic missile, Tehran's most advanced operational weapon, has not been deployed in this conflict. Iranian military officials have confirmed it remains in reserve. At Mach 16 outside the atmosphere and Mach 8 during re-entry, no current interceptor system in the regional theater was designed to reliably stop it. Its operational range covers every Gulf oil terminal, every American regional base, and significant portions of the Arabian Sea simultaneously. Iran is holding its most capable weapon in reserve while winning the economic argument with its second and third tier systems. Washington's tone has changed. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The opening week's language was precise and confident. The language this week is careful and conditional. American diplomatic facilities across the Gulf are closing one by one. Each closure a quiet acknowledgement that the security guarantee underpinning the entire regional architecture is under pressure. Gulf governments that built their entire economic model around American security guarantees are now asking a question they never expected to ask publicly. If the world's largest military cannot protect its own embassies, what exactly are we paying for? Trump's pivot to Kurdish insurgent groups as an alternative pressure mechanism produced its own immediate answer. Every faction approach declined, publicly. On the record, 3 options have now been visibly tested: sanctions, military force, proxy pressure. All 3 are producing costs without producing outcomes. 3 options, all 3 visibly strained. Meanwhile, Iran's second-largest oil customer, China, has quietly increased its purchase volume by 18% since the conflict began. Beijing is buying sanctioned Iranian oil at a 34% discount while global prices spike for everyone else. China is profiting from the exact crisis it is publicly calling for restraint on. That is the geometry of Iran's economic war at full operational scale. The military campaign degrades Western defensive infrastructure. The Hormuz threat fractures coalition unity. The sanctions pressure routes discounted oil toward Beijing. And the financial markets absorb the cost of all of it simultaneously. Every layer feeds every other layer. And at the center of all of it sits one question that nobody in Washington, Brussels, or Tokyo has answered cleanly yet. If stopping Iran militarily is proving this costly, and stopping Iran economically has already failed across 4 decades, what does the endgame actually look like? Because Iran has already decided what its endgame looks like, and it does not require winning a single conventional battle to get there. The numbers arriving from commodity markets this week are not projections anymore. They are receipts. Brent crude has crossed $97 per barrel, a level not sustained since the peak of the 2022 energy crisis. But the crude price is only the visible surface of a much deeper structural problem. Refined fuel costs have increased 28% across European wholesale markets since February 28th. Liquefied natural gas spot prices in Asia have moved 41% higher in the same window. Those percentages do not stay inside energy markets. They travel through logistics costs, through manufacturing inputs, through food production and distribution, until they arrive at the one place every government fears most: the household bill. Germany's federal energy regulator issued a private assessment last week projecting that a 60-day Hormuz disruption would push average German household energy costs up by $340 per month. That is not an annual figure. That is monthly. For a country already managing the political consequences of its 2022 energy crisis, that number represents a threshold its current government cannot survive politically. France does not need a Hormuz closure to feel the pressure. Current price levels have already made its agricultural fuel subsidies structurally insufficient. The protest movements that shut down Paris in 2023 were triggered by increases smaller than what French farmers are absorbing right now. That instability does not stay in the fields. It moves to the streets, then to the parliament. Japan activated emergency strategic petroleum reserve protocols last week, a measure used only once before in the country's modern history. That previous activation was triggered by the 2011 Fukushima disaster. This activation was triggered by a meeting in Washington that Tokyo was not invited to attend. And for everyday Americans, the consequences are arriving through a different mechanism entirely. The United States is not Hormuz dependent for crude oil the way Asia and Europe are. But global oil is priced in dollars on a single interconnected market. And that market does not offer geographic exemptions. American gasoline prices have increased 34 cents per gallon since the operation began. Diesel costs, which determine the price of every product moved by truck inside the United States, have risen faster than retail gasoline figures suggest. The inflation that took 3 years and multiple interest rate increases to partially contain is now being rebuilt from the energy side up. And the Federal Reserve has no interest rate tool capable of addressing a supply shock originating in the Strait of Hormuz. None of this was accidental. Iranian strategic planners understood the transmission mechanism between Hormuz pressure and Western domestic politics with precision that the operation's architects apparently did not fully account for. The target was never the military. The target was always the voter, because voters do not absorb geopolitical arguments at the fuel pump. They absorb prices. And prices right now are making an argument that no military press briefing can effectively counter. Gulf governments that host American military infrastructure are recalculating privately. The calculation is not about loyalty to Washington. It is about survival inside their own populations. Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE are each absorbing Iranian drone and missile pressure while simultaneously watching their own economic stability tested by the conflict their territory is being used to prosecute. The coalition that launched this operation on February 28th looks structurally different today than it did that morning. Not broken, not collapsed, but visibly strained at every seam that Iran's economic strategy was specifically designed to target. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself with explosions. It announces itself 6 weeks later in a fuel price, in a household bill, in a government's suddenly changed tone at a press conference. Iran has spent 40 years learning how to speak that language fluently. The question worth sitting with is not whether Iran can win this conflict in conventional military terms. By almost every conventional measure, it cannot. The question worth sitting with is considerably quieter than that. At what price does the other side decide that winning is no longer worth what winning costs? Iran already knows its answer to that question. The rest of the world is still doing the math.